Before we jump into today's seminar, I just wanted to remind folks that we are now fielding nominations for next semester's seminar. So you should have received an email from me with like a deadline and how to submit those nominations. But if you have any questions about that, please feel free to shoot me an email. Okay, so for today's seminar, I'm very excited to introduce Benjamin Knapp. Ben is an associate professor of silviculture in the School of Natural Resources at University of Missouri. Ben did his bachelor's at Purdue University and his master's and PhD at Clemson. His research addresses practical questions to improve natural resource management, with particular interest in the intersection of restoration ecology and silviculture. He has extensive experience studying frequent fire ecosystems of the eastern US and integrating knowledge of fire ecology into silvicultural practice. Ben was my master's advisor, and we worked a lot on Longleaf Pine, which I'm sure we'll be hearing a bit about today. And I'm really excited for this talk because I know this crowd is pretty familiar with frequent fire here in the Southwest, but it'll be fun to expand our horizons a bit and learn about frequent fire forest ecosystems in the East. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Ben.
All right, thank you, Connor. And I really appreciate the invitation to be here and give this seminar with everybody today. I'm going to be talking about some things that I'm really excited about from a research standpoint. I do a lot of work, as Connor said, with tree regeneration and fire, and a lot of that falls within a restoration context. And so this talk is going to be bringing together information from a variety of different studies I've been involved with, and we'll touch on some of those results as we kind of go through some of the points. Within eastern forest ecosystems, there's really a continuum of structures that we encounter and that we manage for. Currently, there's a lot of interest in open forest ecosystems. So I'm going to talk a lot about open forest ecosystems and their properties and what controls those conditions. So along the bottom of this slide, I have a photograph labeled forest, woodland, and savanna. And these are terms that we use that are describing these different ecosystem types. We'll go through some of the characteristics of them, but a lot of that centers on the structure as well as the composition within those. In some cases, there's some strong edaphic controls on these. So we have certain site conditions that favor a certain ecosystem type. In more rare cases, we can have some site conditions that really restrict or strongly control the ecosystem type. But more often, fire is important if we're looking at this continuum of structure, because a lot of sites in the East are productive. They're productive enough to support forests. So fire becomes really the controlling factor on where a lot of these systems fall in terms of this structure. Given our history of fire exclusion and suppression, so we had the period from the 30s largely till the end of the 1900s, we've seen a lot of ecosystems fill in, so to speak, and express more of a forest condition with high densities. So there's a lot of interest in restoration of more of the open ecosystems. This was from a recent publication that's describing open ecosystems and doing so, describing those as an excluded state with reference to this previous sort of historic fire condition, and depicting much of the East, the central to southern portions of the East, as open forest ecosystems. More of the northern areas, this paper's predominantly saying are the closed forest systems, northern hardwoods, but a lot of the open, or a lot of the more southern areas, you get into pine, mixtures of oak and pine, and then more strictly oak. Again, on these sites, fire becomes the real critical thing for controlling that structure and composition. And there's a number of key papers that touch on some of these ideas and processes. So up here in the upper left, a really sort of pivotal paper in thinking about transition of some of these communities, the idea of messification, that as we get more fire sensitive species that prefer more mesic communities coming into ecosystems with fire suppression. They actually change characteristics of that site, make it less flammable, more difficult to burn, and then create a positive feedback towards fire sensitive species. This paper is talking about densification in the Missouri Ozarks. And so this is related to both changes in composition, but also an increase in the stem densities and what we see on the landscape compared to historic conditions. And then, a lot of these papers kind of center on the need to bring fire back, that we need to restore these open ecosystems using fire. I really like this figure, which is from a publication by Rich Guyette and others from University of Missouri. And it's depicting fire frequencies based on climate and essentially physical characteristics. So precipitation, temperature, and oxygen concentration within the atmosphere to predict where fire could occur on the landscape. So it sort of takes out a bit of the human influence in ignitions and is more driven about the physical environment, which does affect vegetation. So you get fuels that come as secondary effects in there. But from this, we basically see much of that region, the southeastern US, the central region, has the potential for fairly high fire return intervals or fire frequencies. And so this region is really prone to fire. Fire could exist here based on the conditions that we have. When we look at open ecosystems, this is a picture from Missouri of a upland oak woodland, we'd classify it as. But a few of the kind of key characteristics we look at structure wise, we have a relatively open canopy. So the canopy cover tends to be less than 100%. That can vary a bit, but there's a lot of light that penetrates through. An open vertical structure. So we don't see a full mid-story of trees that are coming up through that layer as we see in a real closed canopy fire excluded forest. Composition wise, what we're looking for, we typically have more fire adapted species. We'll talk some about that with trees, but a lot of the interest falls within the ground flora. And we see more diversity typically within the ground flora, where we can get incredibly diverse communities of a lot of forb species, also grasses that come in those depending on some characteristics of the structure and site. But that's really a feature of these ecosystems that is targeted in restoration, developing that herbaceous ground flora. I mentioned a bit about site factors. Really, there's a gradient of how much the actual site controls some of these conditions. What I see in practice is there's interest in restoring open ecosystems across a gradient of site quality. So some sites that are more productive, it's more of a challenge. We have to burn more in order to reduce the woody encroachment and really open things up. And that's an important consideration for some of the management implications. And then management wise, thinning's often used in restoration to initially open the canopies, but then prescribed fire becomes the treatment that is used to maintain that open structure and through time enhance or encourage the ground floor communities as well. I wanted to provide this chart here. This is a Gingrich style stocking chart, which shows characteristics of what was originally developed for forests, but growing space occupancy within forest conditions. So we've got basal area shown on this axis and tree number shown on this axis, and then the percent stocking according to Gingrich here. And there's been research that's classified woodlands or different open ecosystem structures according to stocking. So if we fall above 50 or 75% stocking, we fall into a forest condition. If we're between 75 and 55, we fall into a closed canopy woodland because we still have canopy structure and canopy closure. If we're under 55% stocking, then we're in an open condition with greater amount of light and growing space availability. And under 30% stocking is a savanna. that trees are widely spaced and much fewer on the landscape. So this sometimes gets used by managers as a way to determine a prescription of how open we want to make this canopy a target for thinning or burning treatments in order to reach goals related to stocking. And we'll refer to this chart later in the talk too. Management wise, a lot of what we see happening on the ground is what people call the restoration phase, is that we're starting with this upper condition of a closed canopy forest. And then there's interest in restoring the woodland structure and composition. And we can use some of the tools like the stocking chart or other tools we have to look at targets, so we can try to create or reach the target for structure. And in some ways, this restoration phase is really a short-term objective, because we can use these tools to go from the upper picture, the closed forest, to this more open condition fairly easily. We can thin the forest, and then we can start burning and get a pretty short-term response on some ground flora. But then a question comes in on what happens next. And so managers, we often refer to the maintenance phase, where once we get that structure, then we want to keep burning with frequent fire. Usually what's used is a 3 to 5 year fire return interval, so that we can maintain the open structure, enhance the ground flora, and keep that open ecosystem. But questions come in: if you're burning on that frequency through time, what's happening? Are your canopy trees surviving and thriving? Are you getting some of that regeneration, which we'll focus on? And how is that structure being maintained? So ideally, in a lot of cases, people want to use 3 to 5 year return intervals to maintain the same condition through time. But in fact, sometimes we see that if we get mortality of canopy trees without replacement, that system gets forced to a even more open system or a complete removal of trees. If we go the other way and take fire out of the system, because of the productivity of the sites, we often would revert back to more of a closed canopy dense system. So that the question and some of the challenges in some of these systems would be, how do we maintain the conditions with a fire frequency that matches the processes of the system? So that kind of leads us to one of the questions in this talk. Does the frequent fire that we use for open structure allow tree regeneration so that we can maintain the structure of the tree component through time? So when we look at the open ecosystems across the East, a lot of times I'll say kind of generalize things. We have common targets of structure, targets of increasing ground flora, but there are some really important differences among these systems. So geographically, the forest type differs where you are north to south. Although the structure can be similar, we expect it to be open. Functionally, we expect some similar things with composition. What we have is different species, and they have different fire adaptations, and so they really interact with fire in some different ways. So in this talk, we're going to kind of focus on two key things. The first being how the dominant tree species in these systems differ in terms of regeneration ecology, and how that interacts with fire. And then what the implications of that regeneration ecology would be on long-term stand development. So we'll focus on longleaf pine ecosystems, which is pictured in the lower left, shortleaf pine, and then upland oaks, which have some really key distinctions. When we talk about tree regeneration, this is sort of the generic definition from the Dictionary of Forestry: renewing tree cover by establishing young trees. In the context of this presentation, I'd like to kind of conceptually think about a couple stages or phases of that process. So one of those would be establishment, actually getting new individuals, new trees on the site itself. So new seedlings must establish. A lot of times we're thinking about that from seed, but that could come from another source. If a big tree gets damaged and resprouts, that functionally becomes a seedling. Those new individuals need to persist, especially in terms of a frequent fire regime. that seedlings that establish have to be able to survive with that frequent fire in order to eventually replace the canopy. So that's the second phase. And third is recruitment, that the trees actually have to grow and go from a seedling to a sapling, sapling to a mid-story tree, and eventually a canopy tree. And the term of the fire trap gets used to talk about how woody plants can get sort of stuck in this perpetual seedling phase because fire is going to knock them back. And maybe they resprout, but they never recruit. And so they get caught in the fire trap. So we'll talk a little bit about these dominant tree species and how they differ in regeneration ecology in relation to fire. So first is longleaf pine. And really longleaf pine is of the three we're talking about and of the species in the East, it's really the best adapted tree for frequent fire. This is a picture from the Jones Center in Georgia, down in Newton, Georgia. And we see here, we'll talk a bit about age structure, but we've got trees of different sizes, of different ages intermixed in this open woodland condition. So we've got the open structure, we've got open vertical and horizontal, and we have the ground floor in place. This looks like a really nice open ecosystem. So let's look at longleaf pine and regeneration. For the first phase, the establishment phase, longleaf needs to get mineral soil contact to germinate. And so a frequent fire regime removes a lot of that dense herbaceous vegetation, the grasses, the needle buildup, and then that provides more access to mineral soil for good germination. In general, establishment phase really benefits from fire, and fire is used for site prep to get more seedlings initially established. The persistence phase, in this case for longleaf, the adaptation that the species has is called the grass stage. And this is a morphological adaptation that makes these seedlings persist very well with fire. So this is a picture of a grass stage seedling. It looks like a tuft of grass. The root system develops as soon as that seedling gets established, but there's essentially no height growth, and there's just a tuft of needles above the ground. And then when fire comes through, those needles can be consumed by fire, but the very central portion where the terminal bud and the sensitive tissue is located oftentimes remains green, remains protected, and that seedling lives. And so it puts new needles up and it persists through that fire. This stage allows it to be very resistant to mortality from fire. So I'll talk a little bit about a study that we did to test some of this, which was a lot of fun. We're interested in seeing if we could quantify some of this fire tolerance of longleaf pine seedlings. So we looked at grass stage seedlings in the field, and we stratified, essentially did a sampling to look at seedlings across size classes, anywhere from what would be considered a new seedling, small end of about 1/4 of an inch in root collar diameter, up to what would be an inch in root collar diameter. Typically with these seedlings, when they get to an inch in root collar, they start to elongate and do height growth. So this would be sort of the point where we'd expect seedlings to start emerging from that grass stage. So we had seedlings in the different size classes, and then we used a burn tool to apply fire to those seedlings at different temperatures or intensities. And so we had 4 treatments: a control, what we called a low intensity burn, and what we called a high intensity burn. And then we removed needles to have a mechanical way of removing foliage as well. So here's a picture of this burn tool, basically a furnace that we lowered on top of the seedlings and directed fire to them. And we placed thermocouples around the seedlings so that we could record in real time the temperature the thermocouples experienced. And there's some challenges with thermocouples and some things with that like that, but we're using some other information to try to mimic the experience in low and high intensity prescribed burns that seedlings would experience in the field itself. So these graphs are showing the application of the fire. And so these curves show time temperature curves that we recorded for the low and the high treatments. And so we were very consistent with the way we applied those treatments and got really good results for treatment application in terms of hitting the peaks. And then we looked at the response to seedlings for survival and growth. So we came back, we checked, we measured their growth and checked for survival. And essentially, the results from this study supported a very high level of resistance to mortality from fire once seedlings got to be a 1/2 inch in root collar diameter. So in the left here with the small size class was up to a 1/2 inch. And we saw that mortality, especially as the temperatures increased, mortality increased substantially. But for the medium and large size seedlings, that's up to 1 inch, we had very good survival on all of those. We did a test to look at the season of burn, and with the summer application, there was a bit more mortality, but in general, those large seedlings did very well. So the results of this, one piece of evidence among others that support that very high resistance, high persistence of longleaf pine seedlings with fire, but also that they're not fireproof and small seedlings can get killed. When we look at the kind of field implications of this, there's the idea that longleaf pine regeneration and the occurrence of successful regeneration is partially controlled by fire. So what we see here in this picture is we have a foreground of a dense canopy and then a canopy gap where you've got this dome of longleaf pine regeneration occurring. We often think about competition as being really important for affecting that dome and the presence of those seedlings, but fire is also very important. And underneath the canopy, where there's pine needles that are falling and where there's pine cones, fire temperatures, intensities tend to be greater. There's also more competition, so seedlings tend to be smaller. So you get hotter fires, smaller seedlings, and the trees die. So fire within those intact canopies is killing more seedlings than within those group openings. And you see this through time development of seedlings and openings. So fire is contributing to that. With good growing conditions, so if seedlings are in more open environments, this applies in a lot of the restoration plantings and plantations. Within 2 years, seedlings are typically above the 1/2 inch root collar threshold. So that would mean that they're very resistant to mortality from fire. So it doesn't take very long until seedlings go from germination to being very resistant to fire. And that's going to come into discussion a bit more here. So persistence-wise, longleaf pine is very persistent as a seedling. It can last essentially after 1 year of growing, it can persist fires that come back in the site. And then the recruitment phase for longleaf pine comes into play. And there's an idea that gets talked about a lot, that when seedlings come out of the grass stage, they enter the bolting phase. And that's a period of very rapid growth where they're able to quickly, get above the flame height and are then fire resistant. During that height growth stage, they've begun elongation. They are putting on height growth, but we've done some work to look at the rate of growth of longleaf in that stage versus other species. And it's not exceptional growth. So they are putting on height growth, but they're growing slower than loblolly pine. They're growing slower than sweet gum, other species that occur in the area. So the growth rate itself is not exceptional, but what is exceptional with longleaf pine is the bark thickness for trees that are that small. When they start height growth, the bark is several times thicker than other species around them. And one thought there is that that grass stage allows carbohydrates to build up in the root system that then get allocated to bark growth once that tree starts elongating. And that provides a protection mechanism where they remain very resistant to mortality while they're recruiting, really at any phase during recruitment. And that's a really key thing for longleaf pine. So we're going to conceptualize these fire return intervals for our target species by looking at basically these bars are representing good, suitable fire return intervals for the phase of the process. So anywhere from 1 to 5 year return intervals are pretty good for establishing seedlings, getting new germinants. Really, the more the better. So if it's more frequent, you're going to get more mineral soil and more chances for establishment. After some point, there's just too much litter layer. And if you have too long fire intervals, you won't get good germination. For persistence of longleaf pine, if you burn every year, those new germinants don't get enough growth and they remain vulnerable. But after 1 year of growth, you can start burning. So 2-year fire return intervals are still good for longleaf pine. They can persist through that. And on this end, I put it up to 10 years. At some point, if you don't burn, because they're not growing in height growth, they get outcompeted by other vegetation and they're going to get shaded out and die. So that upper end is a competition driven thing. They can persist a long time, but at some point they're going to die. And then recruitment, I've got a similar bar here. So once they come out of that grass stage, essentially they're pretty resistant to fire the entire time. So you can keep burning them every 2 years and they should still remain resistant to fire. Again, at some point, if you stop burning, you'll have competition effects and the seedlings won't make it, or the saplings. So what this means is we have an overlap of these 3 phases: establishment, persistence, recruitment, burning anywhere from 2 to 5 years on a cycle continuously without interruption, favors all these phases, allows longleaf pine to regenerate through time. Okay, so that works really well for that forest type. So we're going to look at the same thing now for shortleaf pine and upland oaks. And I've put these two together. So we'll look at shortleaf and upland oaks sort of at the same time. And the reason for that, one, there's a bit more overlap in some of the ranges. Shortleaf follows a bit more to the north than longleaf, occurs often together with oaks in mixture. So we have them together, but they also have some more similar characteristics of their fire adaptation. Here's some pictures of very nice open shortleaf pine on the left. That's an old growth stand in Missouri, and an oak woodland there on the right. So when we talk about establishment for both upland oaks and shortleaf pine, similar to longleaf, a very frequent fire return interval tends to be a good thing. The graph on the left is showing the number of seedlings of shortleaf that have occurred in relation to depth of leaf litter. And basically, when we get a buildup of forest floor leaf litter, shortleaf pine just does not establish. So burning every year is good for getting new shortleaf pine seedlings germinated. There's work that shows similar things with oak. Oak's a little bit different in terms of acorns getting buried and the way that the fire interacts with that. But there's support that frequent burning allows oaks to increase their germination and establishment as well. When we go to more of the persistence adaptation, both shortleaf pine and oaks resprout. And so resprouting becomes sort of the persistence mechanism for these different species. On the left, we have a depiction of shortleaf pine, and it's kind of famous for this morphology at the upper root system, which is called the basal crook. And so it's like a J hook or a right turn of that root system just under the surface. And on that portion that's essentially parallel to the soil surface or a lot of buds that can sprout if there's damage above ground. So the soil provides insulation to those buds, and then with fire, you can get top kill and then a resprout and have persistence in that system. Oaks are famous for doing this also. Oaks very vigorously sprout and can stay in a system. This picture, this is a postdoc, Justin, and he's got a chinkapin oak that aged to almost 50 years old in the rootstock, where it had stayed in that system and continually resprouted. And some new techniques have been aging these. It's really interesting work. And then the other picture shows a site that's been burned for 60 years at a 4-year return interval, and it's still full of sprouts. And so we haven't aged those. They could go back all the way till that study started. There could be younger than that, but they're persisting and resprouting every single time they burn. So persistence tends to be a fairly similar mechanism. A lot of times they would get top killed and then stay. Where we get a real difference is the recruitment phase. And so both shortleaf pine and oak require a fire-free period in order to recruit. So having fire stop in that real frequent interval so that they can get out of the fire trap, not be top killed, and then continue to grow. There's some slight differences between these two species. So the shortleaf pine and the upland oaks, there's some apparent differences in the size of the stems at which they become resistant to top kill. And right now that's something of interest because shortleaf pine is difficult to regenerate when there's a lot of oaks around it. And we've had a hard time getting it to be competitive. So potentially fire could be a tool where shortleaf fire could be applied such that shortleaf does not resprout and the oaks or the hardwoods do. And so we could alter species composition. So we have a study where we're looking at this on some state land that's been treated with frequent fire through time. And because of the way they've managed the site, there exists across the landscape a mixture of shortleaf pine in different sizes. So here we have a fairly tall sapling, and then here a very short sapling, and then hardwoods all mixed in, the oaks in similarly in different sizes. So we created pairs of pine and oak that had to occur close enough to each other that they had experienced about the same fire and within similar size classes, so that we could look at the sprouting responses, the top kill for shortleaf versus oak under similar fires. And it's been a really interesting look. This is one example of results on probability of survival without top kill. So what this means is here a value of 1, a fire comes through, that tree is not top killed, it persists. And presumably continues to grow and then is out of the fire trap. Green is shortleaf pine, and so trees experiencing the same fire. We saw that shortleaf pine did not get top killed when those trees were smaller size compared to the oaks. The oaks had to be bigger before they resisted top kill. For example, when shortleaf was about 3 centimeters, the probability, well, let's say 4 centimeters, the probability was about 100 or 1.0 that they survived without top kill. For the hardwoods, it was closer to 8 centimeters before they had that probability. What this means is we can favor shortleaf pine by burning when they reach that threshold size and the hardwoods don't. So we can time the fire to allow recruitment of one versus the other. So that's some really interesting results there. Essentially, you know, what this kind of has been boiled down to in a general sense is that we need to have a fire-free interval for both of these groups, for the shortleaf and the oak. And there's been just general recommendations that for shortleaf, anywhere from 6 to 15 years would allow for recruitment. For upland oaks, 10 to 30 years would be necessary to get recruitment to occur, to get out of the fire trap. And a lot of that would depend on site productivity and fire behavior. So if we go back to our conceptual diagram here of fire return intervals. For both shortleaf and for oaks, establishment can happen very frequently. But for persistence, they're going to resprout really well. So even at very frequent fire return intervals, you'll get resprouting that occurs. But the big difference is the recruitment, and that becomes staggered. To get recruitment to occur, your fire return interval needs to be longer. So for shortleaf pine, we're starting that at 6, and for oak, we're starting that at 10. And what this means is that to get regeneration, the process to happen, is you can't have one static fire return interval of 3 to 5 years forever. You're not allowing that process to occur. So this comes to our second kind of key question in this talk. What are the implications of this regeneration ecology on the development of these stands? I mentioned and had this same slide earlier. Once we get in the maintenance phase, management typically is prescribed to keep fire going on a 3 to 5 year return interval. And so the idea is to keep the open structure. The idea is to keep the ground flora. If we stop that burning, those things can go away. But this creates a bit of a, let's say, a paradox. You want an open structure, which means you don't want mid-story. But at some point, we have to think about regeneration. So how do we get regeneration to occur at the rate we need, in order to keep trees on that in that system and not push it towards something else entirely? So this equates to these long-term effects in terms of age structure that we're seeing with this regeneration process. In concept, a lot of times we think about our open ecosystems as supporting an uneven aged sort of age structure, a continuous canopy, uneven age type of system. And when we look to longleaf pine, that works really well. It's a great example of how that can work, where we have, going back to the picture we looked at before, we have an open system. We have all those characteristics of the open woodland. We have young trees. We have trees in different size classes throughout different ages. And that works because those trees can regenerate and recruit continuously while we burn and maintain everything else. And this is an example of some data from an old growth longleaf area that's been burned through time and the age distribution. There's a lot of young trees and you get fewer and fewer old trees, but you have a true uneven aged mixed system. And so this becomes sort of the poster child of this type of management. I'm going to focus on upland oak here, as it's the one that needs the longest fire free period in order to get recruitment. So it's a bit more extreme, let's say, than shortleaf pine. So how does the fire free period needed for oak affect the age structure through time? Essentially what happens when we get repeated fire and repeated top kill is that we remove what I sometimes call the source population of any new trees. The mid-story trees, those smaller trees, those are forced to resprout, and we maintain this pool of sprouts, but we don't have anything that's coming into larger size classes into the overstory, and it takes time to build that. So there's another study I'll touch on here that gives us a really good, some good evidence of sort of how this works. This is located in Missouri, and as far as I know, this is the longest running prescribed fire study in hardwoods, in oak systems. It's kind of limited in design. It's got 2 blocks, but it's been going since 1950, and it uses annual burning and then periodic burning, which is really every 4 years, and then an unburned control. And they've maintained these treatments consistently over that time. It's been really amazing. So through time, they measured, inventoried the trees about every 15 years or so. And then in 2013, we did a complete census and measured a whole lot of things, so we could look at structure and all kinds of stuff. But one thing that we found, when we just look at diameter distributions, and the structure of these systems. This is the unburned control. And basically what we have here is a reverse J distribution. The scale on these small trees is different than the scale on these big trees. And so everything's sort of brought down here. But what this creates is a reverse J. We have trees in all size classes with no burning. And that's what we expect when we take fire out. Where they burned every single year, we have a bell-shaped distribution, but we have 0 trees in any small size classes. The fire completely removed all the trees less than 10 centimeters. So there's no source population for replacing the overstory through time. And it's going to take time to get a tree from a seedling to a sapling to a 10 centimeter tree. It's going to take decades. And so there's a lag where that's not happening in this system. In the periodic burn, this is burning every 4 years. We have a similar bell-shaped distribution, diameter distribution, but in this case, we have a lot of trees in the very small size classes. And that's because of the resprouting. Here, annual burning got rid of all those sprouts. 4-year burning, those trees continue to sprout. And so they're caught in the fire trap, but they're still there. So they could potentially be released with the fire-free period. We know for a fact on this site that there's been no new trees introduced to the overstory since 1964. So that repeated fire has stopped recruitment completely for that period of time, which is pretty impressive. I mentioned the stocking chart. I won't spend too much time on this, but this is just showing how these stands have transitioned in structure. So the forest, the unburned area is right near 100% stocking, and the 2 burned conditions are in a closed canopy woodland. So the fire's done great for structure, but the potential concern would be that long-term regeneration implication. So from this work, we found that fire essentially prohibits new age classes in that open oak ecosystem. Approaches to this and kind of thoughts about this, I hear a lot that we have an assumption that variation in fire behavior that occurs naturally, you have a hot spot here and a cool spot there, that's going to allow some individuals to recruit. So if you keep burning, eventually you'll get a little variation and something breaks through the fire trap. We haven't seen that in that long-term study. That long-term study is very small plots, and that's often something that gets pointed out. We have some other landscape scale burns that are trending towards a similar result of the long-term study, that the recruitment is just going down through time. So while some trees may come through the fire trap, we don't know how many and if it's enough to reach some kind of structural target in the future. So one thing that some of us have proposed is to start thinking about managing fire-free periods in a way that we sort of liken to an area regulation as a silvicultural practice, where we would purposefully remove fire for a period of time to allow a regeneration phase to occur. So it would look something like this. Here we have a landscape that we're managing completely for woodlands. I apologize, it's a little hard to see the text here, but here we show the starting point. The red areas are burned on a frequent 3-year interval, but then we introduce a no burn period. So in this case, at year 20, this green shading is showing we've taken fire out. We take it out for 20 years. The rest of the landscape we burn, but here in these areas, we allow regeneration to occur, recruitment to occur. Then we put fire back in that landscape. And so through time, it opens back up. The trees have persisted through the recruitment phase and make up the canopy. And we rotate that on the landscape like we apply area regulation in even age silviculture. So what we end up with is a mosaic of areas. Most are in an open state, some are in a recruitment or regeneration state and have a bit different structure. With this approach, we'd have to accept that at some points in time, our open ecosystems, quote unquote, fill in, where you get a release or recruitment, and it loses some of that open structure, but then that gets retained again through time. This picture shows an area that was burned repeatedly and then had 10 years of a fire-free interval. So you see the density of saplings coming in, and then fire was reintroduced. But you lose some of that open structure for a period of time. Okay, so to kind of wrap things up about the regeneration needs and then these long-term sort of management implications. Really important thing, I think, with open ecosystems is that they're not all the same. And the way that the fire is going to be interacting with the species and the tree regeneration has really important implications for how these stands change through time. Longleaf pine is again, our great example of a system where you can burn pretty much without interruption every 3 years, every 2 years in some cases, still get regeneration, recruitment, complex age structures, and everything we want to see. But for shortleaf pine and upland oaks, if we maintain that fire frequency, we're essentially forcing things towards an even age structure because we're not allowing any recruitment. And through time, we're going to get a lag before we can get any new trees to the canopy because we've removed that source population as well. So we need some interruption of that fire. Currently, we manage with prescriptions that don't really include an interruption. It's not a part of silvicultural systems. And so some of the research I'm interested in is looking at how to prescribe something that will work, including that break in fire return interval. And I should mention, I meant to have something on this earlier in the talk, but if we look at historical fire frequencies, we have a lot of variation. We have some cases where in upland oaks, we'll get every 5 years we have fire, but other periods will go 20 years without fire. So that's a part of the historical system, and it's not currently being implemented into management as much as it should be. So that's what I've got. Turn it over to Connor for next things, but I think there should be some time for questions.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, we'll field any questions. Feel free to enter those questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you if you want to ask the question with audio. Looks like we do have a question from Jill. Jill asks, do you think historic fire was also patchier at the within stand scale than the fires that result from modern prescribed burning techniques and protocols?
I think that there are some key differences with historic fires and fire that's applied today. I think one of those things relates to the vegetation and the fuels and the, let's say, the abundance of the hardwood rootstocks. So in areas where we have had fire exclusion and we have such dense, an increase in density of hardwoods, the rootstocks are just everywhere. And so there's a lot that's sprouting. And I think historically that may have been very different, where there was more of a presence of fire and we didn't get an accumulation of rootstocks to provide that source now. So I think that's very different in terms of thinking about what happens with the regeneration. I think in terms of specifically the fire behavior, potentially so. I mean, I think that's certainly within reason. Looking at some of the landscape scale burning that's being done now, where the intention is to let fires follow the topography and follow the fuels. There's still, in terms of at least the hardwood top kill, a lot of consistency with burning under a 5-year return interval in terms of getting top kill on those. So there may be some differences, but I think that frequency also is important for that. We've
got another question here from Jim, who wants to know, what drove fire frequencies in the past in the Southeast? Was that natural fire or burning by indigenous people?
I think some of that may vary by where you are, but both, and certainly indigenous people, evidence supports that that was a critical source of fire in a lot of places in the East, I'll say. In the South, and if you take Florida, where there's a lot of lightning strikes and a lot of lightning strikes during weather conditions that can support fire, there's a prevalence of that source. If we go to Missouri, where the landscape's different, the climate, the weather when we get lightning strikes is different and wetter, it's a lot more difficult to start fires that way. And the indigenous ignition seems to be very important. Fire follows people in a lot of those landscapes.
We've got a question from Zach, who asks, what has public opinion been on bringing more fire back into the landscape?
Yeah, that's a good question. And also, I'd say with this broad range that this talk references, it varies a lot. I think Missouri is, well, I'd say if we go further to the Southeast, fires is fairly well accepted. In Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, there's a lot of burning, there's a lot of smoke that people see. And in some cases, some of the regulations and laws are more friendly towards fire. So there's a lot more of a culture for fire there presently. Missouri, there's a lot more acceptance of fire than Kentucky and Tennessee and some other places as you go further east. So it varies a lot. And I feel like in Missouri, in some ways, we're fortunate that fire is being used as much as it is and people are as accepting. But there's still a lot of the controversy and kind of challenges even within land conservation agencies where there's different viewpoints, and some people think fire should stay out of those woods, and some people want to put it back in frequently and get the trees out of those areas. So those are real things that affect what happens on the ground for sure.
We've got another question from Jose, who asks or says, great presentation, very similar to age structure patterns in the Southwest where age cohorts occur during fire-free periods. Would it be undesirable to have even aged structure?
Good. That's a good question. I would say not necessarily. And I think what's important is having an understanding of the way we're managing towards what our expectation would be. And so with the example of Longleaf, where it's very achievable to have uneven aged with fire, there's a lot of benefits with that structure and doing that. I think it's dangerous sometimes with some of our hardwood systems where it seems to be that's what we want, but we're not managing in a way to achieve it. And in those cases, if we change our thinking to where an even aged structure may be okay, and we have one cohort more or less, then we provide that fire-free period to recruit a replacement cohort. We might have some options then where we have a 2-age stand, or we potentially remove the original cohort, or however we want to deal with that. But that system could be okay for perpetuating our woodland if we're accepting of it. So in my mind, an even age system is not necessarily bad in this case, but I think we need to have a better understanding of how our actions are going to affect that structure long term.
We have another question from Jim, who wants to know if you've done any work in bottomland systems where fire is a lot less frequent. Yeah,
there are a couple of ongoing projects with some graduate students in bottomland systems. And a lot of these still fall within regeneration issues. And Some of those in Missouri are looking at pin oak in particular, but getting hard mass species in bottomlands where flooding is a challenge and fire is really not a part of that. Very, very different in terms of how those systems are working from some of these. But some of the similar challenges in getting those oaks established and recruiting. So that could be, I feel like another long topic. So I don't know how much detail or how much I should go into that. But
I'm curious, you kind of hinted at this on the last slide that you had, but what considerations are there for timing of when that fire-free interval occurs to encourage recruitment? Is that dependent upon when a seed crop occurs, or just looking at like advanced regeneration that's already present on a site? What do you think will be keys for like managers to look for when they want to implement that fire-free period?
yeah, I think one thing that comes into play with that would be when do we want to regenerate the stand? So if we're thinking about it almost from an even age standpoint, that we're going to stop burning and let this whole cohort come in, when's the right time to do that? And there may be indications that the canopy trees are experiencing mortality and we would like to get more trees replacing them. Among the hardwood species, mortality with frequent fire happens a lot more than with pines. Longleaf pine and shortleaf pine as big trees are quite resistant to repeated burning. And you will get some mortality, but those trees will live 300, 400 years. With hardwoods, a few species are very resistant. Post oak, blackjack oak, in some cases chinkapin oak. Some of those species can live a very long time with that fire interval. But some of the others that we currently have in these areas, Quercus alba, white oak, certainly scarlet oak, black oak, that repeated fire can put scars, get rot, and eventually we're seeing mortality of those trees. And especially in our region, they may not live past 80, 90, 100. So you don't get that longevity to where you have sort of more forgiveness, let's say, on when you regenerate. And so the decision needs to be made on when to replace, certainly, to get that cohort coming in. Sort of a variation of your question, and what we're facing with our shortleaf is the question of when do we burn shortleaf to favor it over the hardwoods. And so that's something people are really interested in because the hardwoods grow faster than shortleaf. And so it's really hard for it to be competitive. So that's where getting that right size threshold can guide the managers on when to apply that fire. But the fire-free period would essentially allow shortleaf to get to that point and then burn again. And then the shortleaf is released, so to speak.
Awesome. Thank you. We have like 30 seconds for questions if anyone wants to ask a quick one. I just put the link to the post-seminar discussion in the chat for folks who want to join us for the second hour. I think we'll maybe take a 10-minute break and reconvene in that other Zoom room at 5:10. So I will see you there, Ben, and everyone else. In the meantime, if we could just give Ben a nice round of applause and a thanks for coming to present today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Ben.